It was a Friday night in the heart of Chicago, and the air inside the rooftop bar was thick with excitement. You could feel the energy the moment you stepped out of the elevator. This wasn't just any normal bar, it was the kind of place where you had to know someone to get in. The music was playing at just the right volume, loud enough to feel the beat, but quiet enough that you could actually talk to the people next to you. The city lights were twinkling in the distance, giving the whole room a magical, golden glow. In the middle of this upscale crowd walked a group of 4 friends. They were dressed in their best clothes, laughing loudly and walking with a confident bounce in their step. They had just closed a massive business deal earlier that afternoon. To them, the city felt like it belonged to them tonight. They felt successful, powerful, and slightly untouchable. As they walked through the crowd, looking for a place to settle down, the bar was getting incredibly packed. Every table was full, and people were standing 3 deep near the counter. Then, one of the guys in the group spotted it. Tucked away in a dimly lit corner, there was a small, circular booth. It looked perfect. It was slightly away from the main walkway, offering a little bit of privacy. It was the best seat in the house. There was only one problem. On the table, right in the center, sat a small, metallic stand with a card on it that read "Reserved." Most people would have looked at that sign and kept walking. But this group was riding a high wave of adrenaline and arrogance. They looked at the empty seats, then at the sign, and then at each other. One of them reached out, snatched the sign, and tossed it casually onto a nearby side table without a second thought. They laughed about it, thinking that rules were for other people, not for them tonight. They slid into the booth, making themselves comfortable, spreading their coats out, and waving down a waiter to order their first round of expensive drinks. They felt like kings and queens of the castle, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just taken something that didn't belong to them. They settled in quickly, ordering top-shelf cocktails and appetizers they didn't even need. Their voices grew louder as they began to recount the story of their business victory. They were using big words and laughing at their own jokes, drawing a few annoyed glances from nearby tables. But they didn't care. They were in their own bubble. To them, the reserved sign was just a suggestion, and they were the exception to the rule. They were there to celebrate, and nothing was going to stop them from having the best night of their lives. They drank, they joked, and they watched the room, feeling important as they judged the other people in the bar, completely unaware that their behavior was about to be put to the test. As the minutes ticked by, the crowd in the bar continued to grow. The atmosphere became more electric, waiters were rushing around with trays of drinks, and the music seemed to get a little bit louder. The group in the corner booth was having a great time, fully immersed in their own conversation. They had completely forgotten about the sign they had tossed aside. In their minds, the seat was theirs now. They had claimed it. They were sitting on the soft leather, enjoying the vibe, and feeling like the VIPs they believed they were. However, just across the room, near the entrance, things were starting to move quietly. The bar staff was acting a little differently. The manager, a man who usually looked very stressed, was now standing near the door, looking at his watch and checking his phone repeatedly. He seemed nervous, but in a good way, like he was expecting someone very important. The staff members were straightening their uniforms and wiping down tables that were already clean. The energy at the front door shifted from a casual party vibe to something more anticipatory. Someone special was about to arrive. But the group in the corner booth didn't notice any of this. They were too busy talking about money and success, too busy clinking glasses and soaking up the admiration they felt they deserved. They were laughing so loudly that they missed the way the room seemed to hush just a little bit near the entrance. They were too self-absorbed to see the tall figure step out of the elevator and pull a baseball cap down low over his eyes. The night was still young for them, but they had no idea that their little power play with the reserved seat was about to backfire in a way they never expected. They were comfortable, they were happy, and they were completely blind to the reality that was walking toward them. The atmosphere inside the exclusive rooftop lounge was electric, buzzing with the low hum of expensive conversations and the clinking of crystal glasses. In the far corner of the room, the group of 4 friends was thoroughly enjoying their evening. They were deep into their second round of cocktails, the ice melting slowly in their glasses as they leaned back in the plush leather seats. They had completely forgotten about the small reserved sign they had swiped away when they first arrived. To them, this booth wasn't just a seat anymore, it was a trophy they had won by being bold enough to take it. They laughed loudly, feeding off each other's energy, convinced that they were the most important people in the room. The noise of their celebration created a little bubble around them, blocking out the rest of the world. Meanwhile, near the velvet ropes at the entrance, the vibe was subtly shifting. The manager of the venue, a sharp-dressed man who usually looked calm and in control, was pacing slightly. He kept glancing at his watch and then looking toward the elevator doors with a mix of nervousness and excitement. The security guards nearby stood a little straighter, their eyes scanning the arriving guests with renewed focus. The crowd near the door seemed to sense that someone different was coming in. It wasn't a chaotic scene, but rather a quiet wave of anticipation that rippled through the standing patrons. People were checking their reflections, fixing their hair, and turning their eyes toward the entrance, wondering which celebrity or high-profile guest was about to make an appearance. Suddenly, the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. A single figure stepped out into the lounge. He didn't have an entourage. There were no bodyguards shoving people out of the way, and no loud announcement to announce his arrival. He walked in with a quiet, almost hesitant energy. He was dressed in clothes that you would see on anyone walking down the street, a simple, dark windbreaker that looked like it had seen a few years of use, a pair of well-worn jeans, and scuffed boots. On his head, he wore a faded baseball cap pulled down low, covering much of his face. If you didn't look closely, you might have thought he was just a guy who had come in to grab a quick drink after a long shift at work. But there was something about his posture, a certain heaviness and weariness that made him stand out from the polished, eager crowd. He walked slowly through the room, keeping his head down. He didn't stop to shake hands or wave at the people staring at him. He seemed to be trying to make himself as small as possible, shrinking into his oversized jacket to avoid being noticed. It was clear that he wanted to be invisible. He navigated through the maze of tables and standing guests, moving with a destination in mind. He wasn't looking for the bar or a server, his eyes were fixed on a specific spot in the back corner of the room, the quiet, dimly lit booth that offered the most privacy in the entire venue. As he got closer to the corner, the group of friends became aware of someone approaching. One of the guys in the group, the one who had been the most vocal about their business success, noticed the stranger walking toward them. He watched him come closer, squinting slightly against the dim lighting. Seeing a stranger walking straight at their table put him on guard. He felt a sudden flash of territorial instinct. They had claimed this spot, and he wasn't in the mood to be disturbed by a random person wanting to chat or beg for a drink. He straightened his back, puffing out his chest slightly, preparing to tell the guy to keep moving. The stranger reached the edge of their booth and stopped. For a moment, he just stood there, looking at the empty chair that was pulled out on the opposite side of the table, the chair that had been left open for him. Then, he looked at the 4 people occupying the rest of the booth. His face was partially hidden by the shadow of his cap, but you could see the tiredness in his eyes. He looked like he had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders for a very long time. He didn't look angry. He didn't look entitled. He just looked like someone who desperately needed a place to sit and rest for a few minutes. The booth was circular, but the friends had spread themselves out. Their coats were thrown over the backs of the chairs, and their arms were resting on the table, taking up as much space as possible. There was barely room for another person to squeeze in, let alone sit comfortably. The stranger seemed to realize this. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking at the full table with a sense of resignation. He knew that asking to sit would be an intrusion, but he also knew that this was the spot where he was supposed to be. With a soft, almost apologetic voice, he leaned in slightly and spoke to the group. "Excuse me," he said quietly. His voice was low and raspy, barely audible over the music and the chatter of the bar. "I hate to bother you, but do you mind if I squeeze in here just for a minute? I just really need to sit down for a second." The friends looked up at him, surprised by the request. They looked at his worn-out jacket and his scuffed boots, and then they looked at each other. In their minds, this wasn't a famous actor or a VIP. This was just some random guy from off the street. They didn't see the kindness in his eyes or the humility in his posture. All they saw was someone interrupting their private party. The guy who had been guarding the table let out a loud, annoyed sigh. He looked the stranger up and down, clearly unimpressed. "Yeah, sure, whatever," he said dismissively, not even trying to hide the irritation in his voice. He didn't move his arm. He didn't make space. He just turned his head away and went back to talking to his friends, signaling that the conversation was over. The stranger didn't argue. He didn't demand respect or point out that the table was reserved. He simply nodded his head, a small gesture of gratitude for the smallest of favors. "Thanks," he whispered. He carefully maneuvered his way into the empty spot on the edge of the booth. It was awkward. There wasn't really enough room for him. He had to perch himself on the very edge of the seat, his back twisted slightly to avoid bumping into the person next to him. He looked cramped and uncomfortable, like a bird trying to land on a branch that was too thin to hold his weight. He sat there quietly, surrounded by the loud laughter and the smell of expensive perfume and cologne. He didn't say another word. He didn't pull out his phone to check messages or scroll through social media. He just sat there with his hands resting on his knees, looking down at the table. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, a solitary island of silence in the middle of a loud and chaotic ocean. The friends continued their conversation, ignoring him completely, treating him like a piece of furniture they had to tolerate. They had no idea that the man sitting on the edge of the seat, squeezing himself into a corner to avoid bothering them, was one of the most famous and respected actors in the world. They only saw what they wanted to see, a nobody who didn't belong in their VIP circle. The minutes dragged on, and the atmosphere inside the booth grew increasingly awkward, though only for one person. The group of four friends was completely lost in their own world. They were deep in conversation, recounting stories about their work, bragging about how much money they were going to make, and laughing at jokes that weren't really funny. They were loud, their voices booming over the background music, completely unaware of the cramped stranger sitting on the edge of their table. To them, he was just a piece of background noise, a nobody who had wandered into their spotlight and was now fading into the shadows. For the man in the baseball cap, the situation was uncomfortable, to say the least. He was practically perched on the corner of the circular seat, balancing on just a few inches of leather. Every time one of the friends moved or threw their head back to laugh, they risked bumping into him, but he tried his best to make himself smaller. He kept his shoulders hunched and his elbows tucked in close to his sides, creating as little footprint as possible. He looked down at the table, tracing the wood grain with his eyes, trying desperately to be invisible. It was painful to watch, really. Here was a man who just wanted to rest for a moment, but he was being treated like an inconvenience. The friends, on the other hand, showed zero signs of empathy. They didn't offer him a drink. They didn't ask his name. They didn't even try to include him in the conversation. In fact, they seemed to go out of their way to ignore him. It was a deliberate, cold act. One of the women in the group pulled her chair closer to her partner, creating a physical barrier with her back, effectively shutting the stranger out completely. They adjusted their coats and their bags, spreading their belongings across the table until the stranger had barely any space to rest his arms. It was a silent, aggressive way of telling him, "You are not welcome here. You do not belong with us." The conversation turned even more petty. They started gossiping about other people in the industry, pointing at different patrons across the room and making fun of what they were wearing or how they looked. They were judging everyone around them, convinced that they were the standard of success and style. They spoke with a cruel arrogance, laughing at people who they thought were below them. The irony was completely lost on them. They were sitting next to a man who had more talent in his little finger than all of them combined, yet they were treating him like he was nothing. At one point, the man in the cap shifted his weight slightly, trying to find a more comfortable position. The squeak of the leather against his jeans caused one of the guys to stop mid-sentence and glare at him. The guy rolled his eyes and let out a loud, dramatic huff, as if the stranger had personally offended him by moving. The stranger quickly froze, offering a silent, apologetic nod before going back to staring at the table. It was a shocking display of disrespect. They were acting like bullies on a playground, picking on someone who wouldn't fight back. The man just sat there, taking it all in without a word. He didn't get angry. He didn't stand up and demand respect. He didn't say, "Do you know who I am?" He simply sat with his head down, wearing his worn-out jacket, looking tired and defeated. He seemed used to being misunderstood, or perhaps he was just too tired to care about the ego of a few strangers. He remained the calmest person in the entire booth, a quiet island of dignity in the middle of their storm of arrogance. Around them, the bar continued to fill up. The music was thumping, and people were having a great time. Waiters were weaving through the crowd, delivering drinks to happy customers. The manager was walking around, checking on tables and greeting guests, but he hadn't made his way to the back corner yet. He was busy on the other side of the room, dealing with a large group near the bar. This gave the four friends a false sense of security. They thought they were safe in their stolen booth. They thought they could act however they wanted without any consequences. They were riding a high of power and ego, convinced that the rules of common decency didn't apply to them. The man in the baseball cap let out a barely audible sigh. He looked at the exit, then back at the table. He thought about leaving, just getting up and walking out into the night to find someplace else to sit. But he stayed put. Maybe he was too tired to move. Maybe he was meeting someone there and didn't want to miss them. Or maybe he just didn't want to cause a scene. He stayed on the edge of the seat, silent and stoic, enduring the coldness and the bad behavior of the people next to him. It was a humbling sight, seeing someone being treated so poorly by people who thought they were so much better than him. The friends ordered another round of drinks. They clinked their glasses together, shouting cheers, and spilling a little bit of their expensive cocktails on the table. The liquid pooled dangerously close to the stranger's arm, but he didn't flinch. He just slowly moved his hand out of the way to avoid getting wet. Not a single person said, "Oops, sorry about that." They didn't even notice. They were too busy toasting to their own success and their own cleverness for grabbing the best seat in the house. As the minutes ticked by, the anticipation in the room began to change. The manager had finished with the large group and was now scanning the room again. He looked at his watch, a frown creasing his forehead. He was looking for someone important. He started walking toward the back corner, moving with purpose. The friends were too busy laughing and talking to notice the approaching storm. They had no idea that their time in the stolen seat was running out, and that the person they had been treating like trash was about to be revealed as the person everyone in the room was hoping to see. The air around the booth was heavy with their ignorance, waiting for the moment the bubble would finally burst. The atmosphere in the bar shifted suddenly, like the air pressure changing before a storm. From across the room, a man began weaving through the crowd with a sense of urgency. It was the manager of the venue, a man usually known for his cool and composed demeanor. Tonight, however, he looked frantic. He was checking his watch, looking around wildly, and speaking quickly into his headset. He was moving against the flow of the crowd, dodging waitresses and ignoring guests who tried to wave him down for service. His eyes were darting from face to face, clearly searching for someone specific. The friends in the corner booth were too busy laughing to notice the commotion at first, but the people sitting at tables nearby had stopped talking to watch the manager rush past. As the manager got closer to the dimly lit corner, his pace quickened. He looked stressed, sweat forming on his forehead. He was probably thinking about the disaster that would ensue if he couldn't find the special guest he was supposed to be looking after. He had reserved that specific booth for this person, and now, as he approached the spot, his heart must have sunk. He saw the reserved sign tossed carelessly onto a side table. He saw the booth occupied by a loud, rowdy group who clearly didn't belong there. And then, peering into the shadows of the booth, he saw the person he was looking for. The manager practically ran the last few steps. He bypassed the friends completely, ignoring their annoyed looks as he brushed past them. He went straight to the edge of the booth where the stranger was sitting. The stranger, who had been silently enduring the noise and the arrogance of the group for nearly half an hour, looked up. The manager stopped dead in his tracks, his hands going up to his head in a mixture of relief and sheer panic. The friends froze. Their laughter died in their throats. They watched the scene unfold with confusion, wondering why the manager was freaking out over this random guy in a cheap jacket. The manager leaned in close to the stranger, his voice trembling slightly. "Keanu," he said, his voice loud enough for the booth to hear but filled with genuine respect. "I am so sorry. I didn't know you were sitting here yet." The name hit the table like a physical blow. Keanu. The friends exchanged sharp, confused glances. They looked at the stranger, really looked at him for the first time, trying to see past the baseball cap and the heavy stubble. The man in the cap shifted his weight, offering a small, tired smile to the manager. He didn't look angry that he had been kept waiting or that his reserved spot had been hijacked. He just looked relieved that the struggle was over. "It's okay," the stranger Keanu Reeves said softly. He nodded his head slightly, brushing off the manager's profuse apologies. "I just got here. No big deal." The color instantly drained from the faces of the four friends. The blood rushed out of their cheeks, leaving them pale and shaking. Their mouths fell open slightly. The guy who had been bragging about his business deal just minutes ago suddenly felt very small. The woman who had blocked him out with her back felt like she wanted to crawl under the table. They were sitting shoulder to shoulder with one of the most famous actors in the world. A man who starred in blockbuster movies, a man known for being incredibly kind and humble, and they had treated him like he was dirt. They had taken his seat, mocked his presence, and ignored him completely. The realization was suffocating. The manager seemed to realize the situation instantly. He saw the terrified looks on the friends' faces and the way Keanu was squeezed into the corner of the booth. He didn't yell at the friends. He didn't make a scene that would embarrass them further, even though they probably deserved it. Instead, he focused entirely on making things right for his guest. "We have a private table ready for you in the back room," the manager said quickly, gesturing toward a hidden door near the kitchen. "It's quiet back there. No one will bother you." Keanu nodded slowly. He placed his hands on the table and began to slide out of the booth. The friends instinctively scrambled to move back, pulling their coats and bags out of the way, but it was too little, too late. They were stumbling over themselves to help him now, apologizing profusely, their voices high-pitched and shaky. "Oh my God, I didn't know," one of them stammered. "We are so sorry, please," another one whispered. But Keanu didn't react to their sudden change of heart. He didn't yell at them, and he didn't lecture them. He just moved with a slow, deliberate calmness. Once he was standing up, he stretched his back slightly, stiff from sitting on the edge of the seat for so long. He adjusted his cap. The friends were staring up at him, their eyes wide with regret and fear. They were waiting for him to explode. They were waiting for him to humiliate them the way they had humiliated him. They were waiting for the security guards to come and throw them out. But Keanu didn't do any of that. He looked at the manager, then he turned his gaze toward the four friends huddled in the booth. There was no malice in his eyes, only a quiet sadness. He could have made them feel incredibly small. He could have used his power to destroy their night. But instead, he treated them with a level of grace that was almost hard to watch. He saw them not as enemies, but as flawed human beings who had made a mistake. "It's all good," Keanu said to them, his voice calm and steady. He gave them a small, polite nod, the same kind of nod you would give a stranger on the street. "They were here first. It happens. No worries." The words hung in the air. He was literally taking the blame off them, telling the manager that it wasn't their fault, even though it clearly was. He was protecting their dignity even after they had tried to crush his. It was a masterclass in humility. He wasn't acting. He wasn't playing a role. This was just who he was. The manager looked at the friends with a stern expression, silently warning them to stay put, before turning to guide Keanu away. "Right this way, sir," the manager said, gesturing toward the private room. Keanu took one last look at the table, maybe checking to make sure he hadn't left anything, and then turned to leave. He walked away from the booth without a backwards glance. He didn't want an apology. He didn't want them to grovel. He just wanted to go somewhere quiet and have a drink. The crowd near the bar had noticed who it was by now, and a murmur of Keanu Reeves rippled through the room. Heads turned. People pulled out their phones. But the group in the booth didn't move. They just sat there, frozen in their seats, watching the back of the man they had mistreated disappear into the shadows of the private room. The silence that followed was deafening. The music in the bar seemed to have gotten louder again, but for the four friends, the world had gone completely quiet. The thrill of the night was gone. The victory of their business deal felt meaningless. The expensive drinks sitting in front of them looked like trash. They were left sitting in the VIP booth they had stolen, but they didn't feel like VIPs anymore. They felt like the villains in a story they never wanted to be part of. They had been given a chance to be decent human beings, and they had failed. And now, watching the empty doorway where he had vanished, they had to live with the burning feeling of shame that comes from realizing you aren't the hero of your own story. The heavy velvet curtain swished shut behind Keanu Reeves and the manager, separating the private VIP area from the main bar. As soon as he disappeared from view, the magic bubble that had protected the group of four friends instantly popped. The silence that fell over their booth was suffocating. It wasn't a peaceful silence, it was the kind of thick, heavy quiet that happens when something terrible has just happened and nobody knows what to say. The laughter that had filled the air just moments ago was completely gone, replaced by a ringing in their ears that seemed to get louder by the second. They sat there, frozen like statues, staring at the empty space where the man in the baseball cap had been sitting. On the table, the condensation from their expensive cocktails was starting to drip onto the wood, forming little puddles of water, but nobody moved to wipe it up. The drinks they had been so eager to order now looked unappetizing. The ice was melting, diluting the liquor, much like their egos were rapidly melting away under the harsh light of reality. They were still sitting in the best seat in the house, but suddenly, it felt like the most uncomfortable place on earth. The guy who had been bragging the loudest earlier slowly sank down in his seat. He looked around the bar, terrified to make eye contact with anyone. For the last hour, he had felt like the king of the room, confident and powerful. Now, he felt like a fraud. He replayed the scene in his mind over and over again, how he had rolled his eyes at the stranger, how he had huffed and puffed when the man tried to get comfortable, and how he had dismissed him like he was nothing. The memory burned his chest with a hot wave of shame. He realized with a sinking feeling that everyone in the bar had seen them act like jerks. They hadn't just been rude to a random person, they had treated a beloved movie star like trash, and in a city like this, word travels fast. The girl who had turned her back to block him out wrapped her arms around herself, feeling a sudden chill. She couldn't believe she had been so cruel. She thought about how tired he looked, how he had only asked for a place to sit, and how she had deliberately made him feel unwelcome. She had acted out of arrogance, thinking she was better than him because of her clothes and her business deal. But standing next to him, even in his worn-out jacket, she realized that he had more class in his little finger than she had in her entire body. She had failed a basic test of humanity, and the weight of that failure was crushing her. They started looking at each other nervously, trying to find the right words to break the tension. "Did you know?" one of them whispered, his voice cracking. The others shook their heads quickly. None of them had a clue. They had judged him solely on his appearance. They saw the scruffy clothes and the quiet demeanor and instantly decided he wasn't worth their time. They had categorized him as a nobody without even speaking a real sentence to him. It was a harsh wake-up call to their own prejudice. They realized they had become the kind of people they used to make fun of: shallow, self-absorbed, and cold. The embarrassment was physical. It felt like a hot hand pressing down on the back of their necks. Every waiter who walked past seemed to be looking at them with judgment. Every person laughing at another table felt like they were laughing at the fools in the corner booth. The group realized that their victory of stealing the seat wasn't a victory at all, it was a trap they had walked into willingly. They had traded their dignity for a comfortable seat and a few drinks, and the price they paid was a lesson they would never forget. Most painful of all was the memory of Keanu's reaction. When the manager apologized, Keanu didn't get angry. He didn't demand they be kicked out. He didn't even say "I told you so." He had simply said, "It's all good. No worries." That kindness hurt more than any insult could have. If he had yelled at them, they could have gotten defensive. They could have called him a diva or a jerk. But he had been graceful. He had been understanding. He had treated them with the respect that they refused to give him. That kindness was a mirror, reflecting back exactly how ugly their behavior had been. It showed them that true class isn't about how much money you have or what table you sit at, it's about how you treat people, even when they are treating you badly. The mood in the booth had completely changed from arrogant celebration to quiet shame. The business deal they were celebrating suddenly felt meaningless. What good was success if it turned you into the kind of person who bullied a tired man just trying to sit down? They tried to go back to their conversation, but the words felt hollow. They couldn't talk about money or status anymore. Not after seeing how little that mattered to a man who had millions of dollars and worldwide fame but chose to wear a jacket with holes in it and sit on the edge of a booth to avoid causing a scene. After a few agonizing minutes, they decided they couldn't stay there any longer. The booth didn't feel like a prize anymore, it felt like a cage. They signaled for the check. When the bill came, it was high, but they didn't argue about splitting it or complain about the prices. They just wanted to pay and leave. They left a massive tip, trying desperately to buy back some karma, trying to do one decent thing before they escaped the building. They gathered their coats in silence, moving slowly, avoiding each other's eyes. As they walked out of the bar, the cool night air hit their faces, but it didn't refresh them. The elevator ride down was the longest ride of their lives. They stood shoulder to shoulder, but they felt miles apart. They walked out onto the busy street, merging into the crowd of people heading home or to other parties. Just an hour ago, they felt like they stood above the crowd. Now, they just wanted to disappear into it. They walked away from the building with their heads down, no longer laughing or bragging. They didn't go to another club to continue the party. They didn't feel like celebrating anymore. The night was ruined for them, not because of what Keanu did, but because of what they had done. They had gone into the bar feeling like VIPs, but they left with a valuable lesson that cost them nothing but their pride. They learned that a seat is just a piece of furniture, and a suit is just fabric, but how you treat a stranger is the only thing that truly defines who you are. As they disappeared into the city lights, they carried a heavy burden of regret, hoping that one day they could be as humble and kind as the man they had mistakenly turned away.